Okay, so we're on to chapter 14. We only have one chapter left after this. In this chapter, we're going to focus our attention first on water and then on major minerals. And then in chapter 15, we'll talk about trace minerals, so minerals that you only need in very, very small amounts. And so as usual, I've got our list of learning objectives. And again, I won't read this to you, but again, by the end of chapter 14, hopefully you can look back and recognize that we've covered all of these. So we'll start with the introduction. And so again, we're going to talk about water in a little bit more detail. You should know that our bodies contain more water than any other component. After oxygen, water is the most important ingredient needed for life. Remember that oxygen is the final electron acceptor in cellular respiration, and so it's required to make ATP. But water is, pretty much just as important as oxygen is. Without water, biological processes in our body would cease within a matter of days. Without oxygen, a matter of minutes. And so we can't survive without water. We are unable to store water, so it has to be constantly replenished. We constantly lose water. Our input of water has to equal our output of water. And we'll talk about that in a few slides. Okay, and then, so the other focus of the chapter besides water, again, is we're going to start to talk about minerals. And so many minerals are also vital to health. Minerals are inorganic, which means that they do not contain carbon, which is different from pretty much everything that we've talked about so far. They're inorganic and they are critical to many body functions like cellular metabolism, the transmission of nerve impulses, muscle movement, growth, development. Okay, again, we'll go through specific examples of things as we get into each mineral. Typical American diet, typical diet in high-income countries. Again, we're making kind of a generalization here, but usually diets in these parts of the world have sufficient amounts of most minerals. Okay, that's not to say everyone consumes the right amount of minerals every day, but again, in general, we can make that statement. Minerals are naturally found in food or as additives, and so there are foods that are enriched or fortified with specific minerals. Some individuals, even in high-income countries, have lower than optimal intakes. Okay, and again, that would come along with kind of a poor diet, a diet that's not varied. And then there are some individuals that will have a higher than recommended intake. Okay, so again, we're making kind of a generalization, but there are individuals who fall outside of the norm. We do see deficiencies of certain minerals in low-income countries, and these are major public health concerns. Okay, and so again, in higher-income countries, we don't see a lot of that. Not that it's impossible for individuals to have deficiencies, but again, they're more prevalent in low-income countries where there isn't access to the variety of food that many people, I don't want to say all people, because there are food deserts and individuals who don't have access to, fresh fruits and vegetables, and affordable food. But again, that's more of a concern in low-income countries. Okay. So we'll talk about minerals in the second part of the chapter, or actually in part 2 and beyond. So most of the chapter is about minerals, but we're going to talk about water first. But just to kind of introduce you to minerals here, minerals are divided into two categories, really three, but two main categories. So major and trace minerals. There's also one category below trace minerals that we'll mention when we get into that. Major minerals is what the focus of this chapter is going to be on. And so major minerals, these are going to be minerals that are present and required in larger amounts in the body. They're still micronutrients, so they're still not required in huge amounts like carbohydrates, proteins, fats. But they, in any event, are required in larger amounts than trace minerals. And so in this category falls sodium, potassium, and chloride, which are all involved in maintaining water and ion balance in cells. And then we also have calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and then sulfur we'll just kind of briefly mention. And then again, trace minerals, which we'll talk about in chapter 15. These are required in smaller amounts than the major minerals. And so in this category is iron, zinc, copper, manganese, iodine, selenium, chromium, fluoride, and molybdenum. And so pictured here on the right, we've seen a picture just like this in the previous chapters talking about vitamins. These are some of the roles of minerals in the body. And again, we're going to go through and talk a little bit about each mineral. So you can see there are minerals involved in antioxidant defenses. So selenium, zinc, copper, manganese, water. Water and ion balance. We're going to start with this, talking about sodium, potassium, chloride, phosphorus and water. Blood pressure regulation, we'll mention that this chapter as well. Bone health, we're going to talk about. Blood clotting, blood formation and blood clotting, nerve impulses, muscle contraction and relaxation, growth and development, cell metabolism. And so again, you can see which minerals fall into each category here. Okay, so in 14.1, we're going to talk about water. And so we've briefly mentioned this already. Water is the largest component of the human body. 50 to 75%, depending on what cell type we're looking at. 50 to 75% of our body weight is water. Okay, and again, that's going to vary from person to person. There are other variables that are kind of at play here. And again, different cells will have different amounts of water in them. And we'll talk about extracellular fluid in just a second, but extracellular fluid, the amount of water there can vary as well. In total, we have about 40 liters, which is roughly 10 gallons of fluid, inside of our bodies. And again, that could be inside the cells or outside. And so here we go. Let's name those compartments. So cells contain water and they're surrounded by water. Okay, we call this an aqueous fluid. When you hear that term aqueous, that's water surrounding the cell. So again, inside the cell, we call that the intracellular space. That's inside of the cell. There's going to be water. And there will also be extracellular fluid. That's all the fluid that surrounds cells. And extracellular fluid can be either interstitial. That's going to be the fluid in between neighboring cells. And then we also have intravascular fluid, which is also extracellular. And that's the fluid in blood and in our lymphatic system. Okay. It's really important that in all of these compartments, whether it's intracellular or extracellular, interstitial or intravascular, we have to maintain the right amount of water and the right amount of electrolytes, which we'll get to in just a second. There has to be proper fluid balance, okay, so that our cells maintain appropriate size and shape. They don't take on too much water. They don't expel water, okay, and shrivel up. And so we'll talk about that in just a second as well. So again, in total, we have about 40 liters or 10 gallons of water that make us up. About 63% of that fluid is intracellular. Again, fluid that's found inside of every type of cell in your body, whether it's a blood cell, a bone cell, a muscle cell, an adipose cell, a brain cell. Anywhere we are in the body, there is going to be intracellular fluid. And again, if you've taken general biology or you're taking it right now, if you haven't yet, hopefully you do, that fluid is called the cytoplasm or cytosol. And then there are compartments that also have fluid in them. Okay. Extracellular fluid, again, is going to be both the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid in between cells, and the intravascular fluid, which is blood and lymph. So we'll start up here. About 4 liters of the 40 are intravascular fluid. So again, this is going to be composed of the fluid in your blood, running through veins and capillaries and arteries. And then lymph, which is running through your lymphatic system, your lymph vessels. And then about 11 liters is going to be interstitial fluid. So again, this is fluid between cells. This is also the gastrointestinal fluid, your cerebral spinal fluid, the fluid in your eyes, tears, and also the fluid that lubricates your joints, which is called synovial fluid. Okay, these are all watery fluids. Water's not alone in these. I think that actually, yeah, it's on the next slide. Here we go. So we know where fluid is, right? It's inside of cells, it's outside of cells, it's in between cells, it's in your blood, it's in your lymph, in all regions of your body, really. So again, when we talk about intracellular, inside cells, and extracellular fluid, we're not talking about pure water, okay? This fluid also contains what we call solutes, and this is where minerals come into play. So solutes are going to be dissolved, again, minerals found inside this fluid. Okay, the most abundant solutes are what we call electrolytes. These are going to form when mineral salts like sodium chloride, sodium phosphate dissociate. So dissociate means to come apart in solution to form ions, which are charged particles. Positively charged are called cations, and negatively charged are called anions. Okay, let me take you back up to sodium chloride just to kind of put a picture in your mind. Sodium chloride is common table salt. Okay, so what you find, the white stuff, crystalline stuff that you find inside a salt shaker, right? You might add that to your food. It dissolves once it gets inside your body, if it's not dissolved on the food. Once it gets inside your body, it dissolves, which means it dissociates, right? So the sodium and the chloride come apart. Sodium is a positively charged ion. And so if I look over here in this chart, sodium is Na+, and chloride is Cl-. It's a negatively charged ion, so it's called an anion. And we can see intracellular versus extracellular fluids. So in our extracellular fluids, the major cations that we find, that again are minerals, are sodium, which is Na+, and calcium, which is Ca2+. The major anions, or negatively charged particles that we find in our extracellular fluid, are going to be chloride, Cl-. And then we also find bicarbonate, which is not a mineral. Okay, this is HCO3-. Okay, in our intracellular fluid, so inside of our cells, the major positively charged ions, or cations, are going to be potassium, which is K+, which we'll talk about, magnesium, which is Mg2+, which again we'll talk about, and then the major anions are phosphate and sulfate. Okay, and so again, the point here is that water inside or outside of our cells is not just pure water. It's going to have solutes. It's going to have electrolytes, dissolved mineral substances, and other things. And again, a lot of these will be charged. So positively charged will be cations, negatively charged will be anions. And again, some of these are found, only in the extracellular fluid, or abundantly found in the extracellular fluid. And, inside the cell, you'll find others that are abundantly found. Okay, and so again, just to reiterate what's in this chart, intracellularly, the primary ions that we're going to talk about are potassium and magnesium cations, and then phosphate anions. We will also mention sulfur. And then extracellular fluids, again, are going to contain primarily sodium and chloride, sodium cations and chloride anions. Okay. We'll talk about calcium. Really is going to be stored in bones and in teeth, not inside cells, but making up the hard calcified matrix. We'll get to that. Okay. So when we talk about fluid balance, so again, this is making sure that there is proper fluid balance so that our cells don't swell up or shrink. That's key, right? You want your cells to be the appropriate size, to not take on too much water, and to not lose too much water. And so we have to have, again, proper fluid balance. Electrolytes, so charged particles, minerals, are going to be really important in this process. Okay, so our body controls the amount of water in each compartment by controlling electrolyte concentrations in each compartment. This is really tightly regulated. Our cells tightly regulate the amount of water in each compartment. Again, that's critical for our cells and organs to function. If these amounts are not right, there could be dire, deadly results. So what does this? So if you've taken General Biology 1, you've heard this field before from me. If you're taking it now, you've already heard it as well. If you haven't taken it, unfortunately, you may not have this knowledge. So I'll give it to you kind of in a nutshell. So all of our cells are surrounded by a plasma membrane. And in the plasma membrane, there will be protein transporters. And some of these protein transporters are involved in this process of maintaining fluid balance. And so here we go. Cells will use these things called transmembrane pumps. These are proteins. They're found in the plasma membrane, and they're going to control or regulate electrolyte concentrations in both compartments, intracellularly in the cytoplasm and extracellularly in the interstitial fluid. Okay, so in this picture here, you can see this would be the extracellular fluid, and this is the cytoplasm, which is the intracellular fluid of the cell. This is the plasma membrane, and this big pink thing is a pump. It is a transmembrane protein that's involved in maintaining fluid balance. So it's going to move electrolytes across the membrane to ensure fluid distribution across that membrane in both compartments. Okay, and so again, I don't need you to be too concerned about what the pump does. This is kind of the textbook example. It's called the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump is going to use ATP. This requires energy. It's going to pump 3 sodium cations out, so from the cytoplasm to the extracellular fluid, and at the same time, it's going to pump 2 potassium, K+, electrolytes or charged cations. It's going to pump those eventually in. Okay, so this is just showing how the membrane protein changes shape because of the ATP. It will dump off the sodium, pick up the potassium, change shape again, and dump off the potassium. Okay. So again, cells use these transmembrane pumps. This is a great example. It's the sodium-potassium pump. It's not the only one that functions, but it's one of them. And again, that pump is going to regulate electrolyte concentrations. How many, positively charged cations are on the inside versus the outside, and the same thing with anions. They establish concentration gradients of these electrolytes, and that will cause water to move either into or out of the cell by osmosis. And so water is going to move by this process called osmosis, which is a passive process. It doesn't require energy. And water is going to be transported across the membrane from an area where there is low solute or electrolyte concentration to an area of high solute or electrolyte concentration until equilibrium is reached. And so again, your cells use these transmembrane pumps to move ions so that water can then be moved. Okay, so electrolyte balance is used to make sure that fluid is balanced. Okay, and so these 3 terms come into play here. I'm going to talk about the center term first, which is called isotonic. And so in this example, I have a beaker and I have red blood cells. Okay, and this kind of mimics what can happen inside of your vascular tissue where red blood cells are circulating. Okay, if the fluid, the interstitial fluid or the extracellular fluid around your red blood cells is isotonic, what that means is that the extracellular fluid, so the fluid around the red blood cell, the solute concentration in that fluid is equal to the solute concentration inside of the cell. So the concentration of solutes intracellularly is equal to the concentration of solutes that are extracellular in that extracellular fluid. That's the best case scenario. That's called an isotonic condition. So your red blood cells are in isotonic extracellular fluid. So what does that mean? It means water, sure, is going to move into and out of that cell, right? But it's not going to move in either direction more than the other. So we say that there's no net gain or loss of water in that situation. And so red blood cells, are happy. They're the appropriate size. They're not swelling. They're not shrinking. Okay, that's a good situation. If let's go over here first, hypotonic. So let's say there's a situation where you drink tons and tons of water. We're going to actually talk about this. Overhydration, okay? It's recommended that we get approximately, 8 glasses of water a day. Let's say you drink 100, okay? Or you may have to drink more than that. I don't know what that number is, but you drink way too much water, okay? And so what happens is your extracellular fluid is going to be diluted. Your solute concentration in your extracellular fluid is going to be really low because you have all of this pure water. So it's going to be really, really dilute. And your intracellular fluid is going to have a higher solute concentration. Okay, so high solute in the cell, low solute out of the cell. That's called a hypotonic solution. So when you have a cell that's in surrounding fluid that has less solute, we say that that cell is in a hypotonic extracellular fluid. And that's not a very good situation. What will happen because of the laws of osmosis and diffusion, water is going to move from where there's low solute to where there's high solute. So in this case, from the extracellular fluid to the intracellular fluid. So water is going to move into the cell. That's going to cause a red blood cell, or any animal cell, any human cell, to swell. And if the pumps in the membrane can't act fast enough to increase solute concentration outside, what will happen is that water rushes in, the cell is going to swell, and these cells can actually just burst. And so you can get cell death from that, which again can be deadly. On the flip side, if we come over here to C, this is also not a good situation. And so in this case, it's the opposite. And so in this case, we have a red blood cell that's in a hypertonic environment. So there's hypertonic extracellular fluid. And so what does that mean? So hyper means high solute. And so where's my pointer? Outside of this cell, so in the extracellular fluid, there's a lot of solute, high solute, and inside the cell, there's lower solute. And so water is going to move again from low solute to high solute. So water is going to leave the cell. And again, this is just based on the basic laws of diffusion and osmosis. That's how water is going to move. It moves according to solute concentration. And so water is going to leave that cell, and that cell could, again, shrivel up and die. So again, not a good situation. The best scenario for our cells is to be in an isotonic environment. Okay, functions of water. So again, we've just kind of covered one, right? Water is going to be involved in fluid balance. Water is involved in maintaining blood volume. That's going to permit transport of nutrients. So, the only way you're getting oxygen and, nutrients like, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, minerals, vitamins to the cells in the tissues within your body is by moving them through blood. Okay. And we have to have enough volume in the blood in order for blood to be pumped. And so water is really important in maintaining blood volume. Water is also involved in forming specialized fluids like tears, saliva, bile, amniotic fluid, the fluid inside of our eyes, the fluid in our joints, which is called synovial fluid. Okay. Water acts as a solvent. So there's many reactions taking place in your body that require a solvent. A solvent is the thing that dissolves other things, like minerals, okay? And so again, when you consume salt, right, sodium chloride, water needs to be present for those ions to come apart and function in maintaining water balance. Okay, it's all connected. So again, in order to get stuff to dissolve, you need water to be present. Water is involved in many reactions, including cellular respiration, the one that we talked about, metabolism. It also keeps exposed tissue moist. So for example, many membranes that are, exposed to the air, so eyes, mucous membranes of your nose and mouth, as well as your skin. Okay. Water helps to regulate body temperature. Water has a high specific heat that keeps you in appropriate range. It's why, when you're outside, your blood doesn't boil, right? You are also able to sweat. That is water leaving your body. When water leaves your body via sweat, it takes with it energy, which is heat. Okay, so it's called evaporative cooling. Okay, so again, water allows you it helps to allow you to regulate body temperature. There's a lot more to that. I'm simplifying it, but again, it plays a role. Water also allows you to remove waste products from your body, some waste products from your body via your urinary system, okay, which involves your kidneys, which is very important. Okay, so water needs, I alluded to this before. You have to replenish water, right? You don't store water. You have to take it in every single day. Water can be consumed in both foods and beverages. It is the AI, the adequate intake for water for adult men is 15 cups a day. 1 cup is 8 ounces, so 15 of those a day. And then for adult women, it's 11. Okay. And again, you get water from drinking. Water, pure, water is a great source of water. If you're an athlete and you sweat a lot, you may also want to have electrolytes in that water. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So again, it's recommended that you get about 8 cups of water a day. About 200 milliliters should come from water. And then again, we have food. So, fruits and vegetables are going to have high water content. So that's a great source. And then you do also release water from metabolic processes. Okay, so you make water as well. So water needs, right? Water input here, fluids, food, and from processes happening inside of your body. If we add those all up, total water input is approximately 10 cups, okay? Somewhere around there in that range. And then here's water loss. Okay, so again, you lose water every day, so you have to constantly replenish it. So from what? We lose water through perspiration, right, through our skin, okay? We also, when we breathe out, lung respiration, we lose some water there. We lose water in our fecal material, and then we lose water through urine, okay? And I'll quickly mention insensible versus sensible water loss. So insensible, you're not aware of it, right? So, you lose water through perspiration, respiration, and fecal matter. And again, it's kind of the unaware water loss that happens. You're aware of the water that you lose through urine. Okay. Okay. Water needs are met when input equals output. Okay. So your body has mechanisms to protect against dehydration and overhydration. This involves your kidneys, it's the major organ involved in this, as well as your brain, lungs, and liver. There's hormonal regulation over this. We're not going to get too deep into this. We're just going to talk kind of briefly about dehydration and overhydration. In dehydration, obviously, this is when fluid intake doesn't match fluid loss. So you lose more water than you're taking in. There are signs of this: dry mouth, dry skin, fatigue and muscle weakness, decreased urine output, and also the color of your urine is a good indicator of dehydration. Deep yellow, orange, brown, not good. Okay. There are some things that could color your urine different colors. So for example, if you're taking a high amount of vitamin C, your urine may become dark because you can see that being excreted. But again, generally, your urine color should be, a nice light yellow. Okay. Progression of dehydration, if you don't fix it, at the first signs and symptoms, it could lead to a rise in solute concentration in the blood, okay, because you're lacking water, and that can cause blood pressure to decrease. It can also cause heart rate to increase. Your heart's going to have to kind of work harder. It has less blood volume to pump. This is going to impair every system in your body. Again, if not treated, if you don't try to balance this out, it could lead to kidney failure, seizures, delirium, and coma, and in worst case scenarios, death. Okay, and sometimes, you have to really watch for these signs, especially athletes that are kind of most prone to dehydration. You should drink when you're thirsty, and again, you should watch for these signs. Okay, sometimes we realize dehydration when it's a little bit too late. Okay. Overhydration is the opposite, right? This is water toxicity. You're taking in more water than you're putting out, and so you end up with too much water. It's very rare. There are very few individuals who drink water in excess of the kidney's ability to excrete it. In this week's case study, I give you an example of an athlete who drinks way too much water. But again, it's very rare. When this does happen, water accumulates in the blood and it causes a dilution of solutes, a dilution of electrolytes, sodium being the major one. And we call that hyponatremia. We're going to talk about this again when we get into sodium. And this is not a good thing, right? If you have diluted sodium in the blood and you have too much water, water is going to be pulled into your blood cells, just like we talked about. So these cells would be in a hypotonic environment. And when that water goes into these red blood cells, again, it causes them to swell and they could burst. Okay, so again, overhydration, water toxicity, again, could be deadly. Okay, kind of brings us back to the early chapters when we were talking about the dose is the poison, right? So water is this essential nutrient. We need it in large amounts, right? But if we take in too much, it can be deadly. So too little or too much could be deadly. We need the right amount. We need the perfect input to meet our output. That's going to meet our water needs. Okay, and I'm going to break here. In the next video, we will jump into 14.2.